The exploitation of indigenous people often happens under bright light within the performative space. This was the case on the 10th of May, 1896, when the German monarchy, military and cultural figures gathered to celebrate the opening of the Berlin Industrial and Cultural Exhibit, the Gewerbeausstellung. The first, and for over 50 years afterwards, the most significant German international exhibition. The exhibit came at the height of German colonial jingoism. Less than a decade before, Germany had staked claims to colonial territory across Africa and the Pacific as part of the 1884-5 Berlin Conference. The success of the conference, coupled with the successful annexation of Togoland into the empire shortly afterwards, led to the explosive development of colonial entertainment and performances within the German domestic cultural market. Such interests were present at the Gewerbeausstellung, where an entire section of the exhibit was dedicated to German colonial endeavors, populated by indigenous people from across the empire. This performative square space became defined by its inhabitants and their performances before the Berlin crowds, which offered examples of colonial fetishism and racial ethnography. This paper shall interrogate the performances at the heart of the colonial exhibit. It will study the inspirations behind the villages, how and why indigenous people came to build and populate the colonial space, and how such performances corresponded with or resisted colonial tropes and systems. At the heart of this analysis is historical performativity. According to Karen Barad, historical bodies are not simply objects with boundaries and proprieties. They represent material and discursive phenomenon, made possible through their interactivity and performativity, which means that the performance shapes both performer and audience. Other historians consider the human body and its actions as key to comprehending past communities. For example, Monique Scheer describes emotional bodies as shaping the wider habitus, a sociological term redefined by Bourdieu to understand how human acts shape their more expansive worlds. Such a definition draws from historians of emotion like Ute Frevert and Barbara Rosenwein, who employ the rituals and performances of individual and collective bodies to study the evolution of historical communities. These methodologies shall now be used to understand the significance of the German Gewerbeausstellung and its colonial exhibit, and advance the study of said colonial exhibits, just as Catherine Hall's Civilizing Subjects and the late Suzanne Zantrop's Germans and Indians innovated our understanding between the colonial periphery and the homeland's imagined empires. The 1896 Berlin colonial exhibit represented one of the largest Völkerschauen, the infamous human zoos that defined Imperial Germany's popular culture, but also represented a common trend across most Western world fairs well into the 1950s. Anna Driesbach cites the Hamburg merchant Karl Hagenbeck's business contracts and experience with wild animals, rather than any new innovation, as the cause for his success as the founder of the modern Völkerschauen. Though notes how he gave the performances and performers background stories, underlined with texts, making their subsequent performances more legitimate with the audience. These choreographed performances sought a reputation for scientific and anthropological authenticity that had become expected of them by the German middle and upper classes. This was a more comprehensive example of what Volker Mergenthaler and Driesbach describe as an evolving and, quote, maturing entertainment market, especially within authentic colonial performances. These ranged from the clothes to the dances and the very huts themselves. The 1896 Berlin exhibit was no different. With aid from the Berlin Völkerkunde Museum and other ethnographic organizations, the exhibit had initially sought out 24 indigenous people to help construct and populate the exhibit. This original aim would be overcome, demonstrating such performers' value in the colonial project as ethnographic subjects and business ventures. The 1896 Berlin exhibit in question was dominated by a collection of native villages, which formed part of the colonial exhibition, yet represented part of a long tradition in colonial performances. Covering roughly 60,000 square meters and accessible from Köpenickstraße, there we go, Köpenickstraße, the villages consisted of ethnological exhibits, such as artfully crafted, grotesque South Sea dancing masks, and performances from the indigenous peoples employed at the exhibit. According to letters from the organizers, the villages acted as an alternative medium for visitors to engage with the colonial project via alternative sensory perceptions, thereby making the colonial endeavors of the German Empire more understandable to the German people. The construction of the exhibit's villages by native craftsmen offered the necessary air of authenticity German crowds had come to demand from their Volkerschauens, but also as a way of representing the perceived backwardness of the indigenous peoples. Karl Meinke, or Gustav Meinke, editor of the Deutsche Colonial Zeitung and one of the exhibit's organizers, describes the huts of the Togo representatives as untidy and lacking in iron, though reserved some praise of the craftsmanship's instructive use of vines and roots in home construction. These villages simulated a West African kwikuri, one example of the villages was the West African kwikuri, a fortified settlement consisting of a large defensive wall with further rings of walls, tembe. Constructed by indigenous craftsmen, the exhibit drew upon the colonies to create an imagined, even idealized vision of Germany's colonial empire. And the primary pull for village visitors were the rituals and dances performed by the villagers, which often occurred around 3 p.m. and drew in thousands of observers. Meinke put down the success of the performances as being down to the original and genuine depictions of indigenous culture. These ranged from traditional dances to martial and monarchical displays. But before we move further into the performances themselves, we must explore the motives of those participating. So often overlooked in analyses of the exhibit, in all exhibits, the rationales behind these actors provide greater insight into the colonial system and the agency of indigenous people, while re-establishing the presence of a colonialized people back into the modern historical narrative. Now, those who participated in the performance ranged in social status, from hunter-gatherers and artisans to princes and local dignitaries. The Togo delegation alone included artisans adept with sand and gold, representing the talent demanded from the exhibit's operators. Other representatives were recruited for their political connections. In one letter from the Samoan colonies, the governor recommended a local prince who had recently visited San Francisco and become enamored with the United States. Therefore, a visit to the German Empire's capital was prescribed to cure him of his Anglophilia. The reserve was also present. The sizable Herero delegation, if I can just skip forward. Yes, the Herero delegation who attended the exhibit was drawn from the ruling elite and represented the first diplomatic mission between colonizers and colonized since fighting ended in 1894. Neither were the political pull factors unique to the 1896 exhibit. They were the critical draw factor for the travels of the 1895-7 Samoan Marquard Volkerschau. Like the Berlin performers, the Samoans' natural features and performances were focused in on and emphasized by organizers, while the performers, like the Herero, received diplomatic proximity to the Kaiser himself. The Samoan troops example leads historian Thode Aurora to conclude that many factors drove indigenous people to travel as part of exhibit troops, offering insight into motives that propelled indigenous people into willingly entering the European limelight. Thode Aurora also cites wanderlust and monetary rewards as critical driving factors. For the 1896 exhibit's attendees and performers, the reasons for their attendance were indeed more emotional and or material. When Togolese administrator J.C. Bruce and his son Garter, educated as a shoemaker in Berlin, according to reports, volunteered their services and those of over 20 other indigenous Togolese people, the imperial agents did not question his reasoning. Later, Bruce was interviewed by the Kölnische Zeitung. In it, Bruce praised the German Empire for its civilizing mission and for facilitating his conversion to Christianity. He also cited that though he was not naive about the racial abuse poured upon the performers, he saw it as part of his religious identity, affiliating his experience with that of Christ's. Though he mentioned his familial connections and faith in bringing him to Europe, this did not stop him from receiving a finder's fee of 100 marks on top of his original monthly salary. Ultimately, the figure of Bruce provides deep insight into the contradictory motives indigenous people had in complying with colonizing powers. Most performers saw the exhibit as an opportunity to travel and work. One of those members of Bruce's delegation was a young Cameroonian man called Kowane. He was among the 6 members who elected to remain behind, finding work as a locksmith's apprentice in Dresden and marrying under the name Martin de Bobe and becoming famous, both for being the first African U-Bahn operator in Berlin, but also for his 1919 petition to the Weimar Republic, arguing for the retention of Germany's colonies post-war. Others were not so fortunate. One young man with many self-proclaimed familial connections in Togo complained to the colonial authorities that his tradesman in Berlin was not teaching him as part of his photography apprenticeship. What is made abundantly clear from these examples is that while the exhibit's performances would seek to dehumanize and degrade their performers, the performers themselves did much to assert their agency within and beyond the process. Throughout the various performances, the indigenous people presented themselves and performed with a dual identity. There we go. Though most fulfilled their contracts as exhibits in the colonial imagination, some simultaneously sought to express themselves and their ideals via performances. Nowhere were these personal choices made more apparent than in the costumes some performers adopted during the event. Rather than adopt the ethnographically prescribed garbs of their respective tribes, some tribes took a more modernized or Western view. The Hottentot and Herero performers came dressed in such a manner. The Hottentots being described as coming dressed as South African colonists by Meinke, and with him even regarding the toiletry and perfume of the Herero women as being almost the same as their European sisters. This choice was made for diplomatic reasons. The Herero performers and their tribal representatives had come to Berlin to present their case before the Kaiser and refused to dress following the colonial ideal. Such was the paradox at the heart of the exhibit, a conflict between the actual indigenous people's culture and agency and the performances forced on them by colonizing powers. Such performances drew on regular cliches that dominated the colonial imagination, but also defined the culture of the metropole. Throughout the 19th century, and especially after the German wars of unification, two forms of performative culture came to define the popular imagination of the German Empire, the colonial and the martial. The omnipresence of martial iconography and the mass employment of military musicians within musical performances across the country meant that the military was at the forefront of every performance, even when the music or the performance itself was not grounded in military or martial tradition. By 1896, the cultures of the metropole and imagined periphery had begun to merge, as seen in this picture, leading to colonial performances reflecting the tropes of popular cultural performances that many Germans would have become accustomed to for their whole lives. An example of this can be seen in the dance's hierarchical dominance of kings and chieftains. The Togo delegation performed a traditional dance called a bakor, termed by one reporter as a war dance, whose characteristics showed similarities with the martial performances standard across the metropole, the German metropole. The Volkerschauern exploited its performers' martial and physical exoticism, whilst combining them with the rituals and performances of the German homeland. Following the dance, the performers came before the king, whose authorities made clear through the performed difference by his warriors, who bowed their axes and horsehair whips before him and reaffirmed their allegiance. Once again, the tropes of the metropole inspired the imagined vision of the colonial empire. Within the actual colonies, deference to the Kaiser was a common trope employed by pro-colonial authors to illustrate indigenous deference to Western authority. One case report recorded in the Deutsches Colonial Zeitung describes how, during the celebration of the Kaiser's birthday in Dar es Salaam, local leaders referred to Wilhelm II as our great Sultan. Whether imagined or real, the depiction of the Kaiser as a sultan reflected the need for German policymakers to entrench their hierarchies into pre-existing colonial societies. However, there we go. The other objective of the performance linked them to the darker side of the German colonial imagination, the ethnographic and racial study of the German Empire's indigenous people. The importance of music in German ethnographic studies cannot be understated, since it offered them the chance to connect with foreign people via a cultural performance well known to such researchers. In an article for a colonial newspaper, Dr. Adolf Heilborn described music as a universal performance, quote, "Just as there are no people without language, so there is probably no people who do not have some kind of musical aptitude and who do not express it." Heilborn tied the development of music with that of language, offering indigenous people a self-described yardstick in the form of Germany's civilized musical culture to describe what he believed as, quote, primitive music of the natural people. This use of music as an ethnographic methodology is not unique to German academics. French studies in the 18th century had begun employing songs as proof of the sexual liberality of local indigenous women and the martial disposition of their men. The concept of the natural people was also another trope used by academics and entertainers to classify and codify the colonial periphery, thereby justifying the metropole's domination and civilizing mission over them. In Völkerschauen, these tropes often came through in technical illiteracy and emotional savagery of the indigenous performers, used to present their mind's natural state. Mergenthaler Volker cites the pseudo-scientific authenticity of such depictions as examples of how shows and exhibits use scientific legitimacy, including visiting members from the ethnographic community and its supporting journals, as examples of how, quote, Urwolken, natural folk, were highly sought after in colonial performances. At the Berlin exhibit, martial performances became a vital component in the broader ethnographic value of the show, and in turn, the exhibit's legitimacy within the colonial imagination of its viewers. The practicality of such performances and the fieldwork associated with colonial ethnography was also important. Oh, hold on. There we go. Researchers at the exhibit complained about the difficulties associated with the detailed measurements and observations, the prime difficulty being measuring the performers and their families. Meinke's account of the 1896 exhibit, which dedicated an entire chapter to the subject, including many invasive photographs and detailed descriptions, recalled the challenges that faced the researchers up on the screen. The obsessive level of detail in these reports and these physical exams can be found in the records kept by the teams of academics. The framework used unveils the team's focus in its research. Therefore, it made sense that they would use the performances to study and categorize the indigenous people in the villages. Meinke agrees with this approach, since the performances permitted researchers to, quote, most clearly express the physical forms of the people, their feelings and thoughts, their religious customs and manners. Therefore, while reading through the details of martial performances, the academic and popular tropes of the colonial and German colonial imagination become more apparent and ingrained in the performance. Such is the case of the account of the Togo Jokoto, described by Meinke as leaving the most peculiar impression on him. His description of the performance focuses on the dancer's wild and, quote, animalistic character, and on the main dancer's martial brutality before his king. The performer's, quote, strong movement of his muscles and the violent swaying of his hips was used by Meinke to code the performances as animalistic spasms rather than culturally significant rituals. Meinke also used such performances to define the performer's inherent savagery and, quote, uncivilized nature. For instance, the dance of the Maasai reflected their supposed murderousness and rapacity. Yet Meinke also compared the performance's organization as akin to the ancient Greek hoplite formation. Whether this was to aid the European reader's understanding or to romanticize the performance of an act of noble savagery, this momentary hesitation is broken with his description of the warrior's sudden entrance into the dance, one that Meinke describes with all the vivid imagery of a rabid animal. Such descriptive images leave little to the audience's imagination. The indigenous performer is part warrior, part animal, his powerful physique dominated by unconquerable battle lust, thereby fulfilling the colonial fantasies that had come to dominate the public's imagination. The power such performances had on their audiences and researchers made them valuable in justifying the metropole's treatment of its peripheral subjects. Even in 1896, the Berlin public was split on the colonial exhibit. Even formerly jingoistic publications like Kladderadatsch, which had gleefully celebrated Togo's annexation and snubbing of British colonial interests, showed less interest in the colonial exhibit. Rather, they chose to focus on recent scandals and the German public's growing awareness of colonial atrocities. On the right is Karl Peter, who had been involved in colonial atrocities in modern-day Kenya near Mount Kilimanjaro. This meant that the exhibit's legacy was muted upon opening. However, the historical significance of the exhibit, both as a demonstration of German colonial promotion and as an example of how the imagined periphery was performed, cannot be understated. It provides a profound example of how the German Empire was not only written and read, it was performed, both willingly and often in opposition to the colonial project. Thank you very much.